What happens when a legendary action star and former governor sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself face to face with a host determined to humiliate him on live television? You won't believe what unfolds when Arnold Schwarzenegger's appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live takes a shocking turn that leaves audiences stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew about late-night television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when one of Hollywood's biggest icons refuses to back down from a host who clearly bit off more than he could chew. The tension was palpable from the moment Arnold Schwarzenegger walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. What started as typical late-night banter quickly devolved into something far more sinister, as Kimmel seemed determined to push buttons that should have remained untouched. The Austrian oak had come on the show to promote his latest environmental initiative, but Kimmel had other plans entirely. "Arnold, great to have you back," Kimmel began with his trademark smirk. But there was something different in his tone tonight. "I have to ask, though, with all your talk about the environment and clean energy, isn't it a bit hypocritical coming from someone who drove a Hummer for decades and literally made movies where cities got blown up?" The audience laughed, but Arnold's expression remained stoic. "Jimmy, I think you're missing the point here. People can change. People can grow. I've been advocating for clean energy for over 15 years now. The Hummer thing, that was a different time." "A different time?" Kimmel leaned forward, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "Come on, Arnold. You're telling me the Terminator just suddenly developed a conscience? What's next? Are you going to tell us that pumping iron was actually about inner peace?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably as Kimmel's tone grew increasingly confrontational. Arnold maintained his composure, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his patience was wearing thin. "Look, Jimmy, I came here to talk about something important. Climate change affects everyone, including your children. Maybe we could focus on that instead of trying to make cheap jokes about my past." But Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened by Arnold's measured response. "Oh, so now you're lecturing me about my children. That's rich. Coming from someone who couldn't even keep his own family together. I mean, let's talk about that scandal from a few years back, shall we?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Arnold's jaw clenched visibly, and he leaned back in his chair, his massive frame suddenly seeming even more imposing. "I think you're crossing a line here, Jimmy. My family is off limits." "Off limits?" Kimmel's voice rose slightly, feeding off what he clearly perceived as momentum. "You're a public figure, Arnold. You ran for governor. You've been in the spotlight for decades. Nothing's off limits when you choose to live your life in public." The audience was no longer laughing. The usual late-night show atmosphere had been replaced by something far more uncomfortable, like watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Even Kimmel's regular band members looked concerned as the host continued his relentless assault. "Besides," Kimmel continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension, "isn't it funny how all these Hollywood tough guys like you turn into environmental activists when their careers start winding down? It's like a midlife crisis, but with solar panels." Arnold's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles showing white beneath his tan. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been doing this for a long time, and I've sat through plenty of interviews with hosts who think they're comedians, but what you're doing right now isn't comedy. It's just mean-spirited and petty." The camera caught every micro-expression on both men's faces. As the confrontation escalated, Kimmel's eyes gleamed with what appeared to be malicious satisfaction, while Arnold's legendary composure began showing cracks that hadn't been seen since his most intense political battles. "Mean-spirited?" Kimmel laughed, but it was a cold sound that echoed strangely in the suddenly quiet studio. "I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking. You come on here promoting your environmental crusade, but let's be honest about what this really is. You're trying to rehabilitate your image, aren't you? Clean up the mess you made of your reputation." Arnold stood up slowly, his imposing figure casting a shadow over Kimmel's desk. The host's confidence seemed to waver for just a moment as he looked up at the former bodybuilding champion who had dominated both Hollywood and politics for decades. "You want to know what I think, Jimmy?" Arnold's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the studio's microphones. "I think you've forgotten what this job is supposed to be about. You're supposed to entertain people, maybe even inform them. But what you're doing right now is just ugly." The studio fell completely silent except for the hum of the cameras still rolling. Even the production crew seemed frozen, as they witnessed something unprecedented unfold before their eyes. This wasn't just another late-night show segment gone wrong. This was a complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic, with one of the most recognizable faces in the world refusing to play along with what he clearly saw as a character assassination attempt. But instead of backing down or trying to defuse the situation, Kimmel doubled down with a comment that would prove to be his biggest mistake of the night, setting the stage for what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. "You know what, Arnold?" Kimmel's voice carried a nasty edge that cut through the studio silence like a blade. "Maybe the real reason you're so passionate about the environment now is because you finally realized you've been polluting more than just the air. How's that for some real talk?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Arnold's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disgust, and then something far more dangerous. The audience gasped audibly, and several people could be heard muttering, "Oh no," under their breaths. Even Kimmel's own crew members were shaking their heads, clearly uncomfortable with their boss's latest attack. "Excuse me." Arnold's voice was barely controlled, each word delivered with the precision of a man who had spent years in politics, learning to choose his words carefully. "What exactly are you implying here, Jimmy?" Kimmel leaned back in his chair, apparently misreading Arnold's controlled fury as backing down. "I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it outright. You've made a career out of making messes and then walking away from them. Your movies, your politics, your personal life, it's all the same pattern, isn't it?" The camera operators were having trouble keeping their shots steady, clearly sensing they were capturing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Arnold took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his massive frame now completely dominating the small stage area. "You want to talk about patterns, Jimmy? Let's talk about your pattern. You sit behind that desk every night taking shots at people who are actually trying to make a difference in the world. You think that makes you clever? You think that makes you important?" "I think it makes me honest," Kimmel shot back, but his voice cracked slightly. "Someone has to call out the hypocrisy of people like you who think they can just reinvent themselves whenever it's convenient." Arnold's laugh was cold and mirthless. "People like me? You mean people who've actually accomplished something with their lives? People who've built businesses, served in government, made movies that entertained millions. What have you built, Jimmy? What have you actually contributed to the world besides sitting here every night tearing other people down?" The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the verbal battle unfolding before them. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable. It was becoming genuinely frightening to witness the complete breakdown of civilized discourse on what was supposed to be a light entertainment show. Kimmel's face flushed red as Arnold's words hit their mark. "Oh, that's rich coming from someone who bought his way into politics with movie money and then couldn't even finish the job properly. At least I'm honest about what I am." "What you are," Arnold said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "is a small man who thinks he can hide behind a camera and a live audience. You think you're untouchable because you've got your little kingdom here. But let me tell you something. Respect isn't something you can fake with a teleprompter." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Kimmel's band members were no longer even pretending to pay attention to their instruments. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply flee. Several production assistants could be seen whispering urgently into their headsets, clearly trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. "You want to talk about respect?" Kimmel's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "You think you can just waltz in here and lecture me about respect? You're the one who—" "No." Arnold's voice boomed through the studio, cutting Kimmel off mid-sentence. "You don't get to turn this around. You started this with your cheap shots and your nasty comments about my family. You want to know what's really pathetic? You're so insecure about your own life that you have to try to tear down people who've actually done something meaningful." The former governor's words carried the weight of genuine authority, the kind that came from years of commanding rooms full of powerful people. Kimmel, by contrast, seemed to shrink into his chair, his usual confidence evaporating as he faced a man who clearly wasn't going to be intimidated by studio lights and audience applause. "I'm not insecure," Kimmel protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" Arnold's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Your job is to make people laugh, to give them a break from their problems. Instead, you're using your platform to spread negativity and attack people who are trying to make the world better. That's not comedy, Jimmy. That's just sad." The studio atmosphere had become so tense that even the camera operators seemed reluctant to move, afraid that any motion might trigger an even more explosive confrontation. Kimmel's usual army of writers and producers remained conspicuously absent from the stage area, leaving their host to face Arnold's wrath alone. "You know what your real problem is?" Arnold continued, his voice gaining intensity with each word. "You're jealous. You're jealous of people who've actually lived, who've taken risks, who've achieved something beyond sitting in a studio making jokes about other people's lives." Kimmel's jaw worked silently for a moment, clearly struggling to find a response that would allow him to regain control of the situation. When he finally spoke, his words would prove to be the final straw that pushed their confrontation past the point of no return. "At least I didn't need steroids to make it in Hollywood," Kimmel said with a sneer, his voice dripping with venom. "And at least when I screw up, I don't blame it on being Austrian." The studio went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming as everyone processed what had just been said. Arnold's face went completely stone cold, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits as he stared down at the talk show host who had just crossed every conceivable line of decency and professionalism. "What did you just say?" Arnold's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried such menace that several audience members visibly flinched. The former bodybuilding champion took another step forward, now looming directly over Kimmel's desk like a mountain of barely contained fury. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had gone too far, but unable to back down without losing face completely, doubled down with breathtaking stupidity. "You heard me. We all know the truth about how you really built that body. And as for your political career, well, let's just say maybe stick to what you're good at. Reading other people's lines and flexing." The transformation in Arnold was instantaneous and terrifying. The measured, controlled politician vanished, replaced by something primal and dangerous. His hands slammed down on Kimmel's desk with such force that papers scattered, and the host's coffee mug jumped several inches into the air. "You pathetic little man," Arnold growled, his accent thickening. "With rage, you sit there making accusations you can't prove about things you don't understand. While I've spent my entire life working harder than you could ever imagine. You want to talk about steroids? Let's talk about the steroids of late-night television. Cheap shots, lazy writing, and hiding behind your audience when someone calls you out for being a coward." Kimmel tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped his desk. "Arnold, I think you need to calm down." "Calm down." Arnold's voice exploded through the studio speakers, causing several audience members to cover their ears. "You attack my character, my family, my heritage, my career, and now you want me to calm down. You're not just a bad host, Jimmy. You're a bad human being." The security team had begun moving closer to the stage, but they seemed unsure of how to handle a situation where one of the most physically imposing men in entertainment was having a very public breakdown. Arnold noticed their approach and turned his glare on them briefly before focusing back on Kimmel. "And another thing," Arnold continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had commanded armies on screen and governed millions in real life. "You talk about reading other people's lines. At least when I delivered lines, they meant something. At least my movies inspired people, made them believe they could overcome obstacles. What do your jokes inspire, Jimmy? What do people take away from watching you tear others down night after night?" Kimmel's face had gone pale. All traces of his earlier cockiness evaporated in the face of Arnold's withering assault. "Look, maybe we got a little heated here." "A little heated?" Arnold laughed bitterly. "No, Jimmy. What happened here is that you showed everyone who you really are when you think you have power over someone. You're a bully who hides behind comedy. And when someone stands up to you, you make racist comments about their nationality and spread lies about their achievements." The audience was transfixed, watching what felt like a public execution of their host's credibility. Some were filming with their phones despite strict show policies, knowing they were witnessing television history. The band members had completely abandoned any pretense of normality, openly staring at the confrontation unfolding mere feet from their instruments. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy?" Arnold asked, his voice now deadly calm. "When I made mistakes in my life, I owned them. I faced the consequences. I learned from them and tried to do better. But you just sit there night after night making the same lazy jokes about the same easy targets, contributing nothing positive to the world while tearing down people who are actually trying to make a difference." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Arnold wasn't finished. I came here tonight to talk about climate change, about trying to leave a better world for our children. Instead, I got ambushed by a small-minded man who thinks personal attacks pass for entertainment. You want to know what's really sad? You had a chance to have a real conversation about real issues, but you were too busy trying to score cheap points to recognize the opportunity. The former governor straightened to his full height, his presence dominating the entire stage area. When he spoke again, his voice carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. I've wasted enough time here. This isn't an interview. It's a character assassination attempt by someone who doesn't have the talent or integrity to conduct a real conversation. You're not a comedian, Jimmy. You're not even a decent host. You're just a bitter man with a platform he doesn't deserve. Arnold turned away from Kimmel's desk and faced the audience directly, his voice carrying easily to the back rows without amplification. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see what happens when someone mistakes cruelty for comedy. He began walking toward the stage exit, but stopped and turned back for one final comment that would be replayed millions of times across social media. Jimmy, I've terminated robots, defeated aliens, and governed California through some of its toughest times, but I've never encountered anything as spineless as what I've seen here tonight. The studio erupted in shocked murmurs and scattered applause as Arnold strode off the stage with the dignity of a man who had just delivered a masterclass in how to handle a professional ambush. Kimmel sat frozen at his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and defeat, clearly realizing that his attempt to humiliate a legend had backfired spectacularly. As Arnold disappeared through the backstage exit, the cameras continued rolling, capturing Kimmel's stunned expression and the audience's bewildered reactions. The host's usual end-of-show routine was abandoned entirely as producers scrambled to figure out how to salvage what remained of the program. The confrontation was over, but the aftermath would reverberate through social media and entertainment news for weeks to come, with Arnold Schwarzenegger's dignified but devastating takedown of Jimmy Kimmel becoming the definitive example of how a true professional handles a public attack with class, strength, and unshakable integrity.